To understand why we feel stage fright, we need to go a little back in time and understand the history of public speaking. Why did such a thing even come into existence? Let's look at this through a small story. Now imagine back in the day when a king was ruling his kingdom and he needed to announce something to his people, let them know about something, some change in policy, a war that's about to come, or anything important. There was no email or instant messaging or TV to do that. So he would simply call all the people of his kingdom to the town square. He would stand up on an elevated podium or a stage and simply speak what needed to be spoken to the public. And at that time, nobody really said, the king's body language is not too good. Or, the king looked a little nervous while he was on stage. There was no judgment at that point in time. The person who needed to convey a message simply came on in front of a crowd and conveyed what was needed to be said. And if you look at public speaking at such a practical level, in theory, there's nothing really to be afraid about this particular activity. Now, I know I'm oversimplifying it, but my point is that if we start looking at public speaking as simply something to do when we have something to say of value and we need to say it to the people who need to hear it, we can remove or separate a lot of the feelings of judgment that we might fear when we do an activity like presenting. And that brings me to my first point for why we get nervous on stage. We're too focused on ourselves as opposed to the audience. Taking back from the story of the king, we have taken this concept of public speaking and completely made it a me game. If we have to give a presentation, we keep thinking, what will the audience think of me? What if they judge me? What if they don't like me? When in reality, communications is rarely about the person speaking. It's mainly to do with the listeners or the audience. And when we shift our mindset to not look at it from the point of view of impressing people when we go on stage, but instead ask ourselves one very simple question, which is, what can I say or do that will add maximum value to my audience? When we shift the narrative to that, we stop worrying so much about our stage presence and whether we may forget a line or something or how nervous we are coming across. And the audience will be able to see that we're genuinely trying to add some sort of value, either in the form of information, education, or entertainment to them. And they will forgive small mistakes, or even if we do actually look nervous on stage. So that's the very first thing. We need to shift focus onto the audience instead of ourselves. And not doing that is one of the main reasons that we feel nervous on stage. Point number 2 is not making public speaking a lifestyle. Some of us must have tried reading a book, taking a course or a workshop on public speaking, and after a few days of being involved in that education, when we come out of it, it's like it almost never happened. And the reason for that is that a skill like communications requires consistency. And online courses, books, or 5-day workshops, unfortunately, do not offer that level of consistency. Instead, we need to start looking at public speaking and communications more like a lifestyle. What that means is that all the skills that we focus on when we go on stage. People say, when you go on stage, you should have good body language, you should modulate your voice and your tonality, and you should communicate clearly and concisely. Now, we don't need to apply those things only when we present. We can apply them even in general conversations, which is what we need to start doing. And the more we start treating conversations like a speech, the easier and more comfortable it will be when we actually have to go on stage. Moreover, it provides us a consistent method of practicing communications. And for a lot of us who don't have access to an audience all the time, this really helps. The next reason why we fear public speaking, so many of us try to memorize our speeches. I remember when I started off my journey, every time I had a speech, I would try to memorize every single word. And that would make me so nervous because even if I would forget one word or one sentence, it would completely throw me off. Instead, I've started focusing a lot more on knowing my content as deeply as I can, even talking about it in general conversations. And more importantly, I tried converting all my speeches into stories. And stories are much easier to remember without having to memorize them. This makes it much more likely that I'm calmer before going on stage and less likely to forget lines that might lower my confidence when I actually start speaking. And the fourth reason as to why we suffer from stage fright is because when we go on stage, let's say if we're not very used to public speaking, we try to be as perfect as possible. We want to impress a crowd. We want to not forget any lines. We want to have great delivery. But when we're starting off on our journeys, we don't need to be amazing speakers. Again, as long as we know our content well enough and as long as we genuinely want to add value to our listeners, the speech and the content and the delivery will fall into place much more easily. All the tactics that we teach in this channel and that everybody teaches about public speaking come secondary. The primary goal is to make the audience leave with something that they did not have before. After the speech or presentation is done, did they take a decision in your favor? Did they act on something that you try to persuade them to do so? Did you entertain them in a way that they can never forget? And that is what defines the success of a speech. It's not about impressing. It's about adding value. Now, if you have a speech to give and you're feeling extremely nervous about it, we've created a video on how you can practice for that speech, especially when you have no time to prepare. You can watch that video right here.